seriously popular.
Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. In this week's episode, we look at the battle over Iran's nuclear program and why Trump is threatening hellfire if there is no nuclear deal.
Hey all, I'm Jamie Lynn Sigler, a mom, actor, and advocate. I know how overwhelming it can be trying to decide which treatment is right for you. I've been there. But you should know you're not alone. You can do this. Start with some research, talk to the community, and most importantly, don't be afraid to ask your doctor questions. You might find results that speak for themselves. That's how I landed on Kesimpta. Ask your doctor if Kesimpta, ofatumumab, could be right for you. You can check out the details at kesimpta.com.
If you like this episode, we think you'll love this.
Hey, I'm Kayla Brantley, and I'm one of the hosts of The Trial of Diddy, a weekly true crime podcast where we sift through every element of this truly incredible case. This week, we look into the new addition to Diddy's team and catch up with legal commentator, trial lawyer, and host of Crime Stories, Nancy Grace. It's out now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink, the Daily Mail's weekly global news podcast. I'm David Patrikarakos, and I've spent the last 15 years covering foreign affairs and conflict in some of the world's most dangerous places. But even I have to ask, are we now staring into a nuclear-contaminated abyss?
The US is in position to accept the fact that Iran has already become a nuclear threshold state because of Trump's policy.
What he's basically said is that, if you don't sort of come to a deal within 2 months or whatever it is, then it's going to be all hell will break loose and bombing and so on and so forth. But actually, nobody really seriously thinks he's going to pull that trigger.
If they want to choose to attack Iran, they know this is the worst case scenario, and they have already experienced attacking Iraq, attacking Afghanistan, and the Americans, they have lost every war in the Middle East.
Our problem is that we hope that neither side basically fudges this whole issue in the interest of a great sell.
Iran will go toward nuclear weapon as the best deterrence to preserve its existence.
Well, I think a diplomatic solution is better than a military solution. I mean, let's be honest about it. I don't think anyone is seriously thinking that going to war is a good thing.
Iran says it will brief China this week in advance of a third round of talks with the United States on its nuclear program, as Iranian officials separately accused Israel of seeking to undermine and disrupt the diplomatic process. Donald Trump, who abandoned the nuclear deal between Tehran and the world powers in 2018 during his first term in power, has threatened to attack Iran unless it reaches a new deal swiftly that would prevent it from developing a nuclear weapon. Which is, of course, one way of approaching a highly volatile, religiously fundamentalist, threshold nuclear state that you're trying to sit around a table and negotiate with. One of the biggest sticking points between Iran and the US is the storage or destruction of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Iran wants to keep its stockpile inside the country, but the US rejects this and wants the stockpile's destruction or transfer to a third country, such as Russia. Meanwhile, Iran's already fraught relations with Israel and its ironclad ally, the United States, have nosedived. It's been a long time since we imagined a mushroom cloud hovering over some far horizon. But given these latest clashes between an agitated nuclear power and a threshold one, could we be staring down the barrel of World War III? In this episode, we'll gauge the latest threat levels with Ali Ansari, Professor of Modern History with reference to Iran at the University of St Andrews. And then, crossing the Atlantic, I'll speak to Seyed Hossein Mousavian, who served on Iran's nuclear diplomacy team and is now a Middle East security and nuclear policy specialist at Princeton University. But first, let's turn to Ali Ansari to get his insights as talks between the US and Iran over the nuclear program are set to continue this week. Ali, you and I have been discussing Iran's nuclear program for well over a decade. This is, after all, a crisis that goes back to 2002. Where are we now after all these years?
Well, we're at a situation where obviously the Iranians have managed to ramp up their enrichment. They've obviously been able to sort of increase the number and capacity of their centrifuges. But in a fundamental sense, we actually haven't moved that far on, in the sense that, you know, what Iran is trying to do is to make sure it's a threshold state. And what it's essentially trying to do is it's trying to use its nuclear program for leverage, really, against the West. I mean, that's really where we're at. So every time it has a crisis with the West, it will ramp up enrichment and it will sort of threaten that it's going to do this, that, and the other, withdraw from the NPT, so on and so forth. But at the moment, I don't think it's actually taken a sort of a decision to move beyond that, because what it's doing at the moment serves its interests.
Trump, for all his flaws, Ali, has a track record of making deals in the Middle East. We remember the Abraham Accords. And, you know, just a month or so ago, nobody thought the Iranians and Americans would be in a room talking directly. And yet, there they are. And it seems Trump has bulldozed his way into this.
Well, there's a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. I mean, Trump did mention during his election campaign that he would prefer to find a diplomatic solution. I think shifting all that hardware to Diego Garcia has focused minds in Tehran. I'll be honest. I mean, very few people mention that, but clearly they have sent some pretty serious hardware in terms of bombers and others. And I think that has concentrated minds. And the Iranians are all too well aware, even though they've sort of probably trying to do their calculations as to whether Trump is bluffing or not. Of course, at the end of the day, Trump does have a slightly mercurial personality, and he was the one that knocked out Soleimani back in 2020. So they do have that recognition, in a sense, that he has that possibility of acting spontaneously. But I think the main weakness in some ways of Trump's approach at the moment is that he's given himself a deadline that nobody really seems to think he's going to stick to. So what he's basically said is that, if you don't sort of come to a deal within 2 months or whatever it is, then it's going to be all hell will break loose and bombing and so on and so forth. But actually, nobody really seriously thinks he's going to pull that trigger. So in a sense, he's tied his own hands, because while the Iranians are good at prevarication and like to take their time, there is a truth that the two tracks that are going on alone. This is quite different from 2013, of course, and 2015, or at least at a different intensity. There is a domestic track as well as a nuclear track, and the domestic track for Iran is much, much worse. So in some ways, the longer Trump can string this out, the better deal he'll get. I mean, the Iranians have sort of concluded that the longer they can string this out, the better deal they'll get. I mean, that's the way they're looking at it. It's a question of assessment and working out where you think domestically Iran is. And my view, as you know, as we've discussed, that actually Iran's domestic situation is much weaker than many people think.
Let me ask you something. What do the Iranians think of Trump? You also write that the Persian translation of Trump's Art of a Deal has found a very wide readership in Iran.
I mean, there are distinct groups of Iranians in terms of viewing Trump. So the Art of the Deal was actually translated well before 2016, by the way. I mean, they've been scouring his books to see his modus operandi for some time. And of course, for many in the sort of hardline, the regime sort of establishment, they see Trump as this sort of like Republican who doesn't really give two hoots about anything but business, which is basically the impression they get now, and that essentially they can cut a deal with him. They can relate to that sort of businessman, almost a Barzari mentality, if you will, that they can deal with that. Of course, many ordinary Iranians have a completely different view of Trump. They see Trump as in opposition to the Islamic Republic. And a lot of them, and I'm talking about people in Iran, let's forget the diaspora, people in Iran have often seen Trump as someone who can basically go toe-to-toe with the Islamic Republic and put them under a lot of pressure. So in some ways, what's been happening over the last few weeks is, of course, the regime has been extremely good on the airwaves at basically presenting the talks in a very favorable light. And this serves their interests, obviously, in trying to sort of convey to their own public that here we have an American president that takes us seriously, is effectively legitimizing us by going to talks. Witkoff is, sending lovely tweets to Araghchi, this sort of thing. And that's the message, really. Their target audience in some ways is their domestic audience. They're saying, if you thought Trump was going to come to your rescue, forget it. He's actually going to help us. Now, let's see how things pan out over the next few weeks and whatever. But certainly that narrative is gaining traction, and it's gaining traction on social media. And of course, the American response to that, in terms of its public diplomacy has actually been pretty poor. I think Rubio's had to come up a couple of times and try and sort of set the record straight, so to speak. But at the moment, it has to be said the Iranians have done a much, much better job at controlling the public narrative. And that public narrative is to basically bolster and reinforce the regime's sort of legitimacy and stability at home, and wants to say, we can get this deal and it's going to be good for us.
We are about to enter full-on negotiations. We're going to get the full Iranian negotiating toolkit. Now, an Iranian diplomat once told his British counterparts, "If you wish my countrymen to understand you, speak to their eyes, not their ears." A great phrase which I read in a Substack recently, Ali. What does this mean? And what does the West need to understand, to internalize, to come out on top during these negotiations?
So that quote, which obviously comes from this Persian diplomat in the 19th century to his British counterpart, the way I read it basically is he's saying that all diplomacy, politics is performative, and the visual always trumps the oral, in the sense that the general trumps the detail. And what you're really dealing with here in terms of it being a performative exercise is that it's the psychology of the negotiations that matter and how you present it. So if at any stage, the Iranians are able, and this is what they're trying to do, of course, to present the negotiations as a win for themselves and forget the detail here. They're not looking at the detail. They're looking at the way in which they present it. That is something that they'll be able to take away, of course. I mean, it's sort of idea that, when I think about it, is actually in some ways better phrased by Teddy Roosevelt's notion that what you're having is you speak softly but carry a big stick. What you've got to do is that presentation matters. And the presentation and the performance and the psychology of the negotiations are vital in basically getting to the solution that you want to get to.
There is a cultural element here. As we both know, Iranians, the way they talk, is very circumlocutory. And it's rude to get straight down to business. For the Americans, for the British, you want to get to the point. It's rude to beat about the bush. I remember I used to go and meet with Iran's former ambassador to the IAEA, Ali Sultaneh, who was a wonderfully charming man and would just proceed to lie to me consistently for an hour. But he always made this point, you must speak to us a nice way. We are a nation of 5,000 years, etc., etc., etc. And I find the performative aspect really interesting. And I think it's something that actually Trump and the mullahs might find some common ground. Both are interested in selling deals to their respective domestic populations.
I think that's true in a way. And the problem, I think, for those of us who are looking at this, and as you mentioned, David, we've been talking about this for a very long time. Our problem is that we hope that neither side basically fudges this whole issue in the interest of a great sell. And actually, if it's fudged, actually the chief beneficiary of that will be Iran. I mean, let's be honest about it. If Trump somehow comes away and presents it and says, well, I've got this great deal, but actually you look at the detail and it's much, much more difficult, it's much vaguer, then, people will undoubtedly criticize him. Now, what encourages me in some ways on one level is I don't think Trump will be able to sell that so easily domestically as he thinks he will. I mean, I think, the way in which Russia is approached, even in right-wing American circles, is probably quite different to the way Iran is approached. And if he's seen in a way to be giving too much away to the Iranians, and certainly getting a worse deal than Obama did in 2015, he'll have to pull out every stock to sell that, I think. I mean, it will be extremely difficult unless you see an epiphany in revolutionary values in Iran, which I think, frankly, at the moment, what you're seeing is the triumph of style over substance. But, that goes back to our performative aspect of the negotiations. I mean, it is all a visual treat. And that's the point. The point is, unfortunately, that I think, as you said quite rightly, in some ways, Trump is quite receptive to that anyway. He likes the visual. I did say somewhere in my article that you can sort of see the hand-woven silk carpet of Trump being, commissioned already to be sent to him, and this is the sort of thing that will flatter him. I mean,
Steve Witkoff.
Exactly. So you can see, the Iranians will turn on the charm, and they're very good at it. I mean, to be honest, they're very good at it. I mean, you mentioned 5,000 years of history. Of course, now they're talking about 7,000 years of history. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I mean, there's a really good game of political astrology going on here, which unfortunately, we need to see through.
Ali, something that actually we probably need to spell out. How important is it that we reach a nuclear deal, and why? Because after all, many people think that the JCPOA, the former nuclear deal, was nothing more than a craven capitulation to Iran.
Well, I think a diplomatic solution is better than a military solution. I mean, let's be honest about it. I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's a dynamic going on in Iran, which is internal to Iran, which will happen whatever. I think at the moment, the key element here is that for Iranians within the country who are fighting for their rights and particular freedoms and others, they will not want to see a deal struck by Trump with the regime that actually enables the regime to repress them more. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, a nuclear deal is all well and good, but a nuclear deal achieved in the absence of any recognition of the wider terrain that you're operating in, I think is very dangerous. And I think this is where there will be disagreements. I think that some of those who are, arguing now on social media and others seem to have this false dichotomy between war and an agreement. No, the division of opinion is between a good and a bad agreement. I mean, that's what we're discussing. I don't think anyone is seriously thinking that going to war is a good thing. So I think that's something that you need to clarify. And I think to make, very clear to all those out there that there is also another dynamic going on there, which is basically the desire of the Iranian people themselves to free themselves from this repressive government and regime. So we shouldn't be doing things at the end of the day that prolong the existence of a regime that the Iranian people don't want. I mean, it's basically, it's as simple as that. And while the nuclear issue is clearly an important issue, it needs to be discussed, negotiated within that wider context.
And a final question, Ali. You talk about the wider terrain, and there is a big elephant in that wider terrain, because in the end, this is not just about Iran and the Europeans and the Americans. There is Israel. Israel has said time and time again over decades that it will not countenance a nuclear-armed Iran, and it will do anything to stop that. What role is Israel playing in all this?
Well, I think Israel is holding Trump's feet to the fire, of course, in all this. But it goes back to this point that if the Iranians are willing at the moment to countenance, wait for it, the great Seyed going to Iran and investing and, the $1 trillion bonanza that's awaiting, if you can make that revolutionary epiphany, then it shouldn't be quite so difficult to think about actually some sort of recognition for the state of Israel. And the Iranians have done it before, of course, back in 2002, 2003, they did raise the issue. So it is possible to think about. And of course, it goes to the heart, I think, David, of the core of the problem, that deal with the cause, not the symptom. And if you can arrange a wider Middle East sort of settlement that includes Israel, then a lot of the tensions that we feel will start to wind down. But of course, for the regime in Iran, incredibly problematic for it to do that. It doesn't want to do that. It feels that, the revolutionary ideology dictates that it must be in perpetual animosity with Israel, the West, whatever, barring obviously this sudden volte-face where it decides that actually it's opened up to business with the United States. Again, it reinforces to me that a lot of this is style over substance. And you're absolutely right that in terms of the way in which the Trump administration seems to be approaching this, in siloing the negotiations purely on enrichment and nuclear issues, it's not looking at this wider hinterland. And that wider hinterland needs to be addressed. It must be addressed ultimately. So it's a question, do you want another truce or do you want a peace? You choose. Do you want something that's temporary or do you want something that's durable? If you want something that's durable, there are no quick fixes. You've got to think about this very carefully.
Ali Ansari, professor in modern history with reference to Iran at the University of St. Andrews and author of the Substack Iran Shahra with Ali Ansari. Thank you, Ali. When we come back, we'll be speaking to Seyed Hossein Mousavian, who has served on Iran's nuclear diplomacy team in the past. Stay with us.
Hey all, I'm Jamie Lynn Sigler, a mom, actor, and advocate. I know how overwhelming it can be trying to decide which treatment is right for you. I've been there. But you should know you're not alone. You can do this. Start with some research, talk to the community, and most importantly, don't be afraid to ask your doctor questions. You might find results that speak for themselves. That's how I landed on Kesimpta. Ask your doctor if Kesimpta, ofatumumab, could be right for you. You can check out the details at kesimpta.com.
If you like this episode, we think you'll love this.
Hey, I'm Kayla Brantley, and I'm one of the hosts of The Trial of Diddy, a weekly true crime podcast where we sift through every element of this truly incredible case. This week, we look into the new addition to Diddy's team and catch up with legal commentator, trial lawyer, and host of Crime Stories, Nancy Grace. It's out now wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. Seyed Hossein Mousavian served on Iran's nuclear diplomacy team in negotiations with the EU and is currently a Middle East security and nuclear policy specialist at Princeton University. He joins me now. Welcome, Seyed. In the past, you served on Iran's nuclear diplomacy team in negotiations with the EU. Can you talk us through that process?
It was from October 2003 almost to May or June 2005. The whole issue between Iran and the EU was, first of all, Europeans, they were asking whether Iran is ready to give objective guarantees assuring that the Iranian nuclear program would never divert toward weaponization, which we accepted. And we very clearly, we told them we are ready to go to the highest level of transparency measures and intrusive inspections which internationally exist. And in practice and voluntarily, we accepted to implement additional protocol just to show them our goodwill. And we had the highest level of cooperation with the IAEA for inspections and whatever information they wanted. Even we provided them about 1,000 pages of information which they wanted. Nevertheless, at the end of talks, the key problem which led to failure of negotiations was that the United States was not ready to recognize and to accept the legitimate rights of Iran for enrichment on their non-proliferation treaty. And that's why it was in spring or summer, early summer 2005, negotiations failed.
The United States did subsequently obviously recognize that right to enrichment, and it obviously became central to the nuclear deal of 2015-2016. Why do you think progress was made after those early, and it has to say, quite fraught and critical years?
When Iran mastered enrichment in 2002-2003, then the US policy changed. They said, okay, now we are ready to provide every peaceful nuclear technology, but zero enrichment. I mean, before revolution, full fuel cycle, 100%. After revolution, zero technology, peaceful technology. When Iran mastered enrichment, they said zero enrichment. However, 10 years, 2003 to 2013, negotiations failed because the US policy was based on zero enrichment. The reason the United States in 2013 accepted was because while they increased the sanctions, even international sanctions, and harmed Iran hundreds of millions of dollars, Iranian in return increased the level and capacity of their enrichment program till the point in summer 2013, Iran reached to 2 months of breakout. John Kerry publicly said they had no other option because Iran just had 2 months to break out. I think for Iranians, it was the reason was the sanction, and for Americans was because Iran just had 2 months to break out. That's why they negotiated. That's why Obama changed the US policy from zero enrichment to zero nuclear bomb.
So what you're saying, I guess, the current nuclear crisis that's been going so long, I guess erupted with the revelations of what were then secret facilities at Natanz. We then had another secret facility that was revealed years later at Fordow in Isfahan, in the mountain near there. So you're saying essentially that Iran undertaking what was then covert building of facilities in the end was vital to self-sufficiency to get to the Americans to accept Iran's nuclear fuel enrichment cycle.
Iranians, they had no other option in order to master their fuel cycle confidentially, secretly, covertly, because the US was officially denying every right of Iran for peaceful nuclear technology on their non-proliferation treaty, even providing a simple fuel for Iran. And that's why Iran had no other option.
Do you accept then, or do you agree with the many public statements of Iranian officials over the years that Iran has zero interest in a nuclear bomb?
The reality is that Iran has remained really fully committed to non-proliferation treaty after NPT. Look, Iran is the most sanctioned country because of nuclear issue. While Iran does not have nuclear bomb, and Iran has been the most inspected country by the IAEA during last 40, 50 years after revolution. But they kept their commitments to NPT, despite of all these crazy sanctions. Trillions of dollars Iran has been damaged just for not having nuclear bomb, but they have kept their commitment to remain under NPT. Moreover, Iran is the only country in the world which religiously has issued a fatwa that nuclear and all weapons of mass destruction are haram, forbidden. That's why I believe they are really serious. And if the US and the West would respect the normal, legitimate, legal rights of Iran under NPT, Iran would remain non-nuclear weapon state forever.
You are correct in that when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, Iran was still in compliance with the commitments of the deal, according to the IAEA. You are correct. However, the IAEA has also expressed dissatisfaction with certain Iranian behavior over the years. For example, AQ Khan documents were found in papers that Iran handed to the IAEA. There are unanswered questions about Iran's nuclear program. That is also fair to say, is it not?
Part of IAEA's statements are political statements because of the Board of Governors. Board of Governors are dominated by the Western countries. And you know how they treat non-proliferation issue, their double standards. If a country like North Korea has nuclear bomb, it has less sanction than Iran, which does not have nuclear bomb. If a country like Israel has nuclear bomb, they are supporting at the highest level of economic, political, security issues. They have their own double standards.
Let's move things now into the present day. It's been something of a surprise to people that the Americans and Iranians are at the negotiating table. Why do you think this has happened so quickly?
I think that the reason, again, is like 2013. 2013, Iran was eager to negotiate to get a deal because they were really under pressure because of the sanctions. And the US was really under pressure because Iran had just 2 months to break up. Okay, then President Trump withdrew from JCPOA, imposed the most comprehensive sanctions on Iran, and Iran increased the level and capacity of enrichment. Today, Iran has just 1 week to break out. Therefore, the US is in position to accept the fact that Iran has already become a nuclear threshold state because of Trump's policy. I mean, Iran had 1 year to break out under JCPOA. Trump withdrew. Iran now has 1 week to break out. Practically, Iran has become a nuclear threshold state. Therefore, Trump has 2 options. As he said, either to make a peaceful deal based on non-proliferation treaty, get every objective guarantees that Iranian nuclear program would remain peaceful, based on NPT, based on transparency measures, based on verification, and based on limiting the level and the capacity of the Iranian enrichment. Or if they want to choose to attack Iran, they know this is the worst case scenario, and they have already experienced attacking Iraq, attacking Afghanistan, and the Americans, they have lost every war in the Middle East, and they are not going to repeat the same defeat in a new war.
What about from the Iranian side? Because I would say that if the Iranians were under pressure in 2013, it's worse now. No, they are sanctioned, but they also have huge internal problems, the women life freedom protests, the droughts, the financial crisis.
No, I think the most important problem Iranians they have is about the economy. I mean, demonstrations or social issues or human rights or democracy, there are some shortages. There is no doubt about it. But the real issue is the economic problem. I mean, the Iranian economy is suffering from inflation, depreciation of the national currency, and a lot of other issues. Therefore, once again, as I said, in 2025, Iran is extremely under pressure economically because of 1,500 sanctions imposed by President Trump, and then another 600-700 sanctions imposed by President Biden. And the US is under pressure because Iran just has 1 week to break out.
A third round of talks between Foreign Minister Araghchi and US Envoy Steve Witkoff is scheduled to take place in Oman on Saturday. What will both parties be expecting or hoping that will emerge from this meeting?
I think the problem with these coming negotiations is the fact that there is a big dispute within Trump's administration. The National Security Advisor, Mr. Ward, publicly said Iran's enrichment program should be dismantled. Secretary Rubio just yesterday said Iran does not need enrichment, they can import fuel. I think he forgot that for 15 years, 1980 to 1995, Iran was telling the US, we don't want enrichment, just give us fuel, and Americans, they were rejected. How? Now, President Trump himself has repeatedly said, the only thing I want, no nuclear bomb. And Witkoff also has had contradictory statements. Once he said, we want a deal based on verification. Once he said, no enrichment. Therefore, the Iranian partner, still they don't know, they are confused. What is the real position of the United States? Whether this is based on verification, transparency measures, non-proliferation treaty, or they are asking for a dismantling of enrichment. If there is about dismantling of enrichment, I assure you there would be no deal. It's impossible. But if the US is asking for no nuclear bomb, I am confident personally that Iran would cooperate at the highest level with International Atomic Energy Agency to give every access, transparency, open nuclear program, even to limit its enrichment from 60% to below 5%, and even to export the excessive amount of stockpiles they have.
And what would Iran want in return for this, do you think?
Just simply, it's very simple, to recognize the legitimate and the rights of Iran under non-proliferation treaty. Do not discriminate Iran compared to the other members of NPT, Japan, Brazil, Argentina, Germany, Netherlands. They all have enrichment, but they don't have nuclear bomb. And Iran wants to be treated the same. And second is lifting the sanctions.
Well, Iran has already been recognized on the first instant under the old deal. So I guess what you're saying is the lifting of sanctions, and you believe this should be isolated from Iran's wider regional behavior, its actions in Iraq, its actions in Yemen, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and so on.
The people, they all talk about Iranian regional policy, but we should not forget it was the U.S. attacked Afghanistan, it was the U.S. attacked Iraq, it was the U.S. Saudi Arabia, they attacked Yemen, it was NATO, U.S., they attacked Libya. All wars in the Middle East has been initiated by the U.S. and NATO and the Western countries. Iran has never attacked any country. Iran was attacked by Saddam, and the West and the U.S., they were supporting Saddam's invasion of Iraq. Therefore, if we are going to look for peace and stability in the region, first of all, we need to get a good lesson that the fact is that the wars in the Middle East has created the most delicate problems and complications, including the expansion of terrorism, poverty, dysfunctioning of the governments, failed state. We have failed state in Libya, we have failed state in Syria, all because of the wars launched by the US or NATO or even the US allies. Therefore, once again, I have always said, if there is going to be a single deal between Iran and the US, this deal would not be sustainable. And that's why Iranians and Americans, they need to begin with the most important issue, which is the nuclear. If the nuclear deal is reached, and if it is implemented correctly by both parties, then they need to negotiate on the other disputed issues like regional issues. Iranians also, they have their own complaints. Americans, they have their own complaints about the regional policies of Iranian side and Iranian about the American policies in the region. They need to negotiate about the region.
In the end, it's not just Iran on one side and the United States and the Europeans on the other. Israel is also a big factor here. Israel has said many times, successive leaders, that it will not stand for a nuclear-armed Iran and that it will act accordingly. What role do you think Israel is playing in all of this?
During the first period of President Trump, 2016 to 22, I think Israel played the most destructive role to dismantle the JCPOA. It is not what I am claiming. It is what Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly, officially said, that I convinced President Trump to withdraw from JCPOA. I convinced President Trump to impose sanctions, a maximum pressure policy. I convinced President Trump to designate Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group. Therefore, he publicly said all mess is created by Israel. Now, the question is whether Israel is going to have the same influence on White House, or White House would be able to have an independent policy of United States. This is number one, because Israelis' policy is clear: attack Iran. I mean, they have said to dismantle the nuclear program, attacking nuclear program, and so on, so and so. The second issue is that the current conflict, security military conflict between Iran and Israel, is really a disaster. There should be initiative to stop. The Iran-Israel military security conflict should be stopped. And I think the United States can play a role, and Israelis and Iranians, they should be able to somehow be committed not to attack each other or not to threaten by force. I mean, based on United Nations security, based on United Nations Charter. And third is the regional countries. I mean, I agree with you. This is not only about Iran and the US. We have regional countries, and we need a broad dialogue between Iran and its Arab neighbors in order to create a new security and cooperation mechanism in the Persian Gulf to resolve Persian-Arab rivalries or hostilities for decades before revolution and after revolution.
I want to end by asking you, perhaps a question is at the heart of all this. If there is no nuclear deal, what do you see? A nuclear-armed Iran?
Again, I think it depends to American policy. If there is no deal, if the US would continue to increase sanctions and pressures, Iran would not divert its nuclear program toward weaponization. Iran would remain a nuclear threshold state, would not master nuclear bomb. But if Europeans are going to use the snapback mechanism, and if Iran would be attacked by Israel or the US or both, Iran will withdraw from JCPOA, will withdraw from non-proliferation treaty, and will go toward nuclear weapon as the best deterrence to preserve its existence.
Thank you to Seyed Hossein Mousavian and Professor Ali Ansari, and to you for listening. Join me, David Patrikarakos, next time as we continue to bring you dispatches from a world on the brink. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at Apocalypse Now Pod, and you can get in touch via email at apocalypsenowpod@dailymail.com. We'll see you next week as we ask once again, Apocalypse Now.
If you like this episode, we think you'll love this.
Hey, I'm Kayla Brantley, and I'm one of the hosts of The Trial of Diddy, a weekly true crime podcast where we sift through every element of this truly incredible case. This week, we look into the new addition to Diddy's team and catch up with legal commentator, trial lawyer, and host of Crime Stories, Nancy Grace. It's out now wherever you get your podcasts.